Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something pretty different. We're not talking about Disney princess stories here. This is the real deal, where queens plotted revolutions because their husbands ignored them, where kings threw away entire kingdoms for their boyfriends, and where a royal love affair could spark wars that lasted centuries. Before we get into all this medieval drama, go ahead and hit like if you're into this kind of thing, and subscribe if you actually want more of these chill history deep dives. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love seeing who's hanging out with us from around the world. Alright, get comfortable, turn down those lights, maybe throw on a fan for some background noise, and let's figure out together what love was basically kryptonite for medieval royalty. Picture, if you will, a summer evening in the year 1137, when the dying light filters through tall windows of colored glass, casting jeweled patterns across stone floors that have been worn smooth by countless royal feet. The air carries the scent of roses from carefully tended gardens, mixed with the lingering fragrance of beeswax candles and the faint smokiness of hearth fires that never quite die, even in the warmest months. In this world of whispered secrets and silk rustling against stone, we meet a 15-year-old girl whose heart would reshape the very foundations of medieval Europe. Eleanor of Aquitaine enters our story not as the legendary queen she would become, but as a young duchess standing in the great hall of her father's castle, surrounded by the gentle murmur of courtiers and the soft padding of servants' feet across rushes scattered with dried herbs. The light catches the golden threads woven through her gown, and if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the quiet intake of breath from those who witness her presence. She possesses something that goes beyond mere beauty, a quality that makes the very air around her seem to shimmer with possibility. Her inheritance is vast beyond imagination. Aquitaine stretches from the Loire Valley down to the Pyrenees, encompassing lands larger and richer than many kingdoms. Vineyards climb gentle hillsides where monks tend their vines with the same devotion they show their prayers. Markets bustle with merchants selling spices that carry the scent of distant lands, while troubadours gather in castle courtyards, their voices weaving tales of love that dance dangerously close to the forbidden. But wealth and land, dear listener, are not what make Eleanor's story so quietly revolutionary. It is something far more dangerous. The radical notion that a woman, even a queen, might choose where to place her heart. When Eleanor's father dies unexpectedly, leaving her the most eligible heiress in Christendom, the political machinery of medieval Europe begins its slow, inexorable turn. Picture the scene. Messengers on horseback galloping through countryside still misty with morning dew, their horses' hooves drumming against packed earth as they carry news that will reshape kingdoms. In the royal chambers of France, King Louis VI lies dying, and his son, young Louis VII, receives word that fortune has placed the greatest prize of the age within his reach. The marriage arrangements unfold with the careful precision of a chess game played by masters. In the soft glow of candles that never quite banish the shadows from medieval halls, contracts are drawn up on parchment that crackles softly under scribes' careful hands. The scratching of quills fills chambers where great lords lean over tables, their voices low and measured as they divide lands and futures with the same care a merchant might show when counting precious coins. Yet even in this world of calculated politics, something unexpected stirs. When young Louis VII first meets Eleanor in the Cathedral of Bordeaux, where their wedding will seal her fate to France, there is a moment, captured by chroniclers who witnessed it, when the carefully orchestrated political marriage threatens to become something more dangerous. Something that resembles what the troubadours sing about in their ballads. The wedding itself unfolds like a dream painted in gold and crimson. The Cathedral of Saint-André rises around them, its stone columns reaching toward heaven, while the air fills with the deep, resonant notes of Gregorian chant. Eleanor stands in robes that catch the light filtering through stained glass windows, each colored pane telling stories of saints and miracles. The scent of frankincense drifts through the sacred space, mingling with the perfume of flowers scattered by young maidens who walk before the bride. But observe the subtle signs, dear listener, the small details that hint at the storm to come. Eleanor's eyes, as described by the chroniclers of her time, hold a quality that makes even bishops shift uncomfortably. There is intelligence there, and something more unsettling. The quiet confidence of someone who has never learned to accept that her desires should be secondary to the needs of kingdoms. Their early married life plays out in the royal palaces of France, where the days follow patterns established by centuries of tradition. Morning prayers in chapels where colored light falls across worn stone altars. Formal meals served on silver plates while musicians play gentle melodies from hidden alcoves. The rustle of silk and velvet as courtiers navigate the intricate dance of court protocol, their voices never rising above the respectful murmur appropriate to royal presence. Yet beneath this surface of mannered calm, tensions begin to gather like storm clouds on a distant horizon. Louis XVI, raised in the austere tradition of medieval Christian kingship, expects his queen to embody the virtues praised by church fathers: piety, humility, and above all, the quiet acceptance of her husband's will in all matters. But Eleanor has been raised in Aquitaine, where the culture blooms with different flowers entirely. In her southern courts, troubadours have begun to sing of something revolutionary: the idea that love might exist independently of marriage, that the human heart might have desires worthy of pursuit even when they conflict with duty. These are not merely songs for entertainment, but philosophical statements wrapped in melody, ideas that seep into the consciousness of those who hear them like wine soaking into bread. Picture Eleanor in her chambers as evening settles over the royal palace, the last light of day fading beyond windows that look out over gardens where nightingales are beginning their songs. She sits surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting, women who have followed her from Aquitaine and who carry with them the perfume of a different world. Their conversations, conducted in voices soft as silk brushing against skin, touch on subjects that would make the bishops of France pale with horror. They speak of the troubadour Andreas Capellanus and his theories about courtly love, ideas that suggest that true affection might exist in relationships that have nothing to do with the marriage bed. They discuss the subtle art of the glance, the carefully crafted compliment, the dance of attraction that might unfold between a lady and a knight who serves her court. These are conversations that would be considered treasonous if overheard by the wrong ears, yet they continue in whispered tones that barely disturb the air. Eleanor's influence begins to spread through the French court like morning mist seeping through castle walls. Young knights find themselves writing poetry where once they would have composed only military reports. Ladies of the court begin to expect a different kind of attention from their husbands, a courtesy and romantic devotion that goes beyond the basic provision of protection and dowry management that had satisfied their mothers. The change is subtle at first, barely noticeable to those not trained to observe the delicate shifts in court behavior. A knight lingers a moment longer than necessary when helping a lady from her horse. A conversation about falconry extends into discussions of poetry and philosophy. Music played during evening meals begins to feature songs that speak of longing and unfulfilled desire, rather than the traditional hymns of praise to God and King. But young King Louis VII, despite his genuine affection for his beautiful queen, begins to sense that something in his carefully ordered world is shifting beyond his control. The reports reaching him from court observers speak of changes that disturb the natural hierarchy he has been taught to maintain. Queens, they suggest, should inspire devotion through their piety and motherhood, not through the dangerous magnetism that seems to emanate from Eleanor like heat from a carefully banked fire. The crisis comes, as such crises often do, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the slow accumulation of small disappointments and misunderstandings. Eleanor's failure to produce a male heir becomes a source of whispered speculation throughout the court. In chambers lit by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on stone walls, courtiers begin to murmur that perhaps God is expressing his displeasure with a queen who seems more interested in the arts of love than in the duties of motherhood. Meanwhile, Eleanor finds herself increasingly isolated in a court that seems determined to reshape her into something she has never been. The troubadours who had followed her from Aquitaine find their songs less welcome in halls where bishops hold increasing influence over the king. The conversations that had once sparkled with wit and philosophical speculation grow more guarded as courtiers learn to watch their words with the care of merchants counting gold. Yet, even as the walls close around her, Eleanor's influence continues to spread beyond the borders of France. Knights and nobles who visit the French court carry stories back to their own lands. Tales of a queen who embodies a new kind of feminine power, one that relies not on the traditional virtues of silence and submission, but on intelligence, beauty, and the dangerous art of making men desire her approval. These stories take root in courts across Europe, like seeds scattered by wind. In England, in the Holy Roman Empire, in the smaller kingdoms of Spain and Italy, nobles begin to hear whispers of this different way of understanding the relationship between men and women, between power and desire. The idea spreads that perhaps marriage need not be merely a business arrangement between families, that perhaps there might be room in royal unions for something that resembles the passion sung about by poets. The Second Crusade provides the stage for the next act of Eleanor's quiet revolution. When Pope Eugenius III calls for a new holy war to reclaim the Christian territories lost to Muslim forces, Eleanor sees an opportunity to escape the increasingly stifling atmosphere of the French court. She announces her intention to accompany her husband to the Holy Land, bringing with her a retinue of ladies who will transform the character of what had traditionally been an exclusively male enterprise. Picture the preparation for this extraordinary journey. In the chambers of the royal palace, seamstresses work by candlelight to create garments suitable for both the rigors of travel and the dignity of queens. Eleanor commissions clothing that walks a careful line between practical necessity and royal magnificence. Riding habits in rich fabrics that will withstand the dust of long roads, while gowns suitable for diplomatic receptions in the courts of Byzantium and the Crusader kingdoms wait in carefully packed traveling chests. The departure itself becomes a spectacle that will be remembered and discussed for generations. Eleanor rides at the head of her company of ladies, her horse stepping delicately along roads that stretch toward horizons shimmering with possibility. The very sight of armed and mounted women accompanying a crusading army sends ripples of shock and fascination through every village and town they pass. But it is in the East that Eleanor's story takes its most dangerous turn. In the ancient city of Antioch, ruled by her uncle Raymond, she encounters a world that makes even her sophisticated Aquitanian court seem provincial by comparison. Here, Byzantine influences mingle with Arab learning and Crusader pragmatism to create a culture of unprecedented refinement and complexity. The Palace of Antioch rises around visitors like something from the stories told by merchants who have traveled the Silk Road. Marble columns support arches that frame gardens, where fountains splash among flowers that bloom in colors unknown to Northern Europe. The air carries scents of jasmine and orange blossoms, while the sound of water moving over stone creates a constant, gentle music that seems to encourage quiet contemplation and intimate conversation. In this atmosphere of luxury and intellectual sophistication, Eleanor finds herself drawn into conversations that range far beyond the narrow concerns of medieval European politics. Scholars gather in chambers cooled by ingenious systems of air circulation, their discussions touching on philosophy, poetry, astronomy, and the subtle arts of governance, learned from watching how different cultures approach the eternal problems of human nature. It is here, in these perfumed gardens, where the distinction between East and West blurs like colors bleeding together in silk, that Eleanor's relationship with her uncle Raymond develops into something that will scandalize Europe and provide her enemies with ammunition for decades to come. The exact nature of their connection remains wrapped in the discretion that medieval chroniclers employed when discussing matters too dangerous for explicit description. But the implications ripple outward like stones dropped in still water. What we know is this: Eleanor extends her stay in Antioch far beyond what political necessity requires, despite her husband's growing discomfort with the arrangement. She appears frequently in the company of Raymond, their conversations lasting long into evenings cooled by breezes that carry the sound of distant music and the splash of fountains. Observers note the quality of attention they pay to each other's words, the way their discussions seem to create an invisible barrier that excludes the rest of the world. Louis Sasset, struggling to maintain his authority in this alien environment where his queen seems to flourish while he withers, finally demands that they continue their journey to Jerusalem as originally planned. It is then that Eleanor makes the decision that will echo through the remaining decades of her life. She announces, in words that carry the quiet finality of steel striking stone, that she intends to remain in Antioch with her uncle. The confrontation that follows unfolds behind closed doors, but its effects ripple through the crusading army like wildfire spreading through dry grass. Voices are raised in chambers where they had never been raised before. Ultimatums are issued and rejected. The fundamental assumptions about marriage, duty, and royal authority that had governed Eleanor's relationship with Louis are examined and found wanting by a queen who has discovered that there are other ways to live. In the end, Louis exercises the ultimate royal prerogative. Eleanor is removed from Antioch not through persuasion or negotiation, but through the simple application of superior force. She is placed under what amounts to house arrest and transported to Jerusalem, where the remainder of the crusade unfolds in an atmosphere of barely concealed marital crisis. But the damage, if we can call it that, has already been done. The story of Eleanor's defiance in Antioch spreads through the networks of communication that connect medieval Europe like spider webs glittering with morning dew. In courts from England to Germany, nobles hear whispered accounts of a queen who dared to assert her own will against her husband's commands, who chose her own company and made her own decisions about where to bestow her attention and affection. The journey home to France passes in a silence heavy with unspoken recriminations and abandoned hopes. Eleanor travels in a litter hung with curtains that provide privacy but also isolation, her retinue reduced and carefully watched by Louis's men. The roads that had seemed to shimmer with possibility on the journey east now stretch endlessly under skies that seem perpetually overcast, each mile carrying them toward a future that both know will be different from their shared past. Back in France, the royal marriage limps toward its inevitable conclusion like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Eleanor and Louis attempt to maintain the appearances required by their royal status, but the foundation of trust and affection that had once supported their union has been irreparably damaged. Court observers note the careful distance they maintain from each other. the way their conversations never venture beyond the strictly necessary exchange of information about matters of state. The annulment, when it finally comes in 1152, surprises no one who has watched the slow dissolution of royal affection play out in the corridors and chambers of the French court. The ecclesiastical courts find sufficient grounds in consanguinity. The distant blood relationship between Eleanor and Louis, that had been overlooked during the optimistic early days of their marriage, to declare their union invalid in the eyes of God and man. But even as one chapter of Eleanor's story closes, another begins to unfold with the speed and inevitability of a river flowing toward the sea. Within weeks of her annulment from Louis XVI, Eleanor makes a decision that will reshape the political landscape of Western Europe more dramatically than any military campaign or diplomatic treaty. She chooses to marry Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, a man 11 years her junior, who possesses ambitions as vast as her own estates, and a personality that burns with the same restless energy that has always driven her beyond the boundaries that others accept as permanent. Their wedding takes place in the Cathedral of Poitiers, with a speed that leaves contemporary chroniclers struggling to keep pace with events. The ceremony itself unfolds with all the traditional magnificence, the cathedral filled with the sound of sacred music, the air heavy with incense, the bride and groom standing before altars that have witnessed similar promises for centuries. But there is something different about this union, a quality that makes even experienced court observers pause in their careful chronicling to search for words adequate to capture what they are witnessing. This is not the marriage of political necessity that had bound Eleanor to Louis XVI, nor is it simply the attraction of wealth and power that draws most royal unions together, like metal filings moving toward a magnet. Instead, there is something that resembles what the troubadours have been singing about, a genuine meeting of minds and hearts that promises to create something new in the world of medieval politics. Henry Plantagenet possesses the kind of dynamic energy that seems to animate everything around him. Courtiers describe the way he enters a room like a storm front moving across open country, bringing with it the possibility of sudden change and dramatic transformation. His mind moves with the same restless speed as his body, leaping from legal scholarship to military strategy to administrative reform with an agility that leaves slower thinkers struggling to follow his reasoning. Eleanor recognizes in Henry something that she had never found in her first marriage: an intellectual equal whose ambitions match her own and whose vision of what royal power might accomplish extends far beyond the traditional boundaries of medieval kingship. Together, they begin to dream of an empire that will stretch from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, united not merely by conquest, but by a new understanding of how to govern peoples and territories with different languages, customs, and traditions. Their court, established first in Poitiers and later expanding throughout Henry's growing territories, becomes something unprecedented in medieval Europe. Eleanor brings to their partnership the cultural sophistication of Aquitaine, with its traditions of poetry, music, and philosophical speculation, while Henry contributes the administrative genius that will transform scattered territories into a coherent empire. The troubadours who had been scattered by Eleanor's departure from France find new welcome in the courts of this emerging Angevin empire. Their songs, which had once seemed merely entertaining diversions from the serious business of government, begin to take on the character of official court philosophy. The idea that love might exist independently of marriage, that individuals might possess rights and desires worthy of respect, regardless of their political utility, begins to seep into the administrative documents and legal precedents that will govern Henry and Eleanor's territories for generations to come. Picture the evening gatherings in their various castles and palaces, where the day's business of governing gives way to entertainment that serves purposes far more serious than mere pleasure. Eleanor presides over discussions that range from the practical problems of administering justice across linguistic and cultural boundaries to the abstract questions of philosophy and theology that fascinate the greatest minds of their age. These are not formal academic debates conducted according to the rigid protocols of university scholarship, but rather conversations that flow like wine poured from silver cups, touching on whatever subjects capture the interest of participants whose minds have been sharpened by the day's engagement with the real problems of governance. A discussion of taxation policy might evolve into speculation about the nature of human motivation, while analysis of a diplomatic crisis could lead to examination of whether rulers have obligations to their subjects that transcend mere military protection. But it is in Eleanor's establishment of what she calls her courts of love that the revolutionary implications of her ideas about the relationship between personal desire and political power become most clear. These gatherings, held in chambers decorated with tapestries that tell stories of legendary lovers and heroes, bring together the most sophisticated minds of the age to deliberate on questions that had never before been considered suitable for serious intellectual attention. The cases presented to these courts read like exercises in moral philosophy, disguised as entertainment. Should a knight's loyalty to his lord take precedence over his devotion to a lady who commands his heart? Can love exist between individuals whose social stations make marriage impossible? What obligations do rulers have to consider the personal happiness of their subjects when making decisions about marriages and political alliances? These questions, debated by Eleanor and her chosen advisors with all the seriousness that other courts might devote to questions of war and peace, establish intellectual precedents that will influence European thought about the relationship between individual desire and social obligation for centuries to come. The very idea that personal happiness might be a legitimate consideration in political decision-making represents a radical departure from the medieval assumption that individual desires should always be subordinated to the needs of family, church, and state. Eleanor's influence spreads through the networks of kinship and alliance that connect medieval Europe's noble families like threads in a vast and intricate tapestry. Her daughters, married into the royal houses of Castile, Sicily, and Saxony, carry with them the ideas about female agency and the legitimacy of personal desire that they absorbed in their mother's courts. Her sons, raised in an atmosphere where their mother's intelligence and political acumen are treated as valuable resources rather than dangerous aberrations, develop expectations about marriage and governance that will reshape the kingdoms they inherit. Yet, even as Eleanor's ideas about love and power take root across Europe, the practical realities of medieval politics continue to assert their ancient authority. Henry's empire, built through a combination of inheritance, marriage, and conquest, requires constant attention to prevent its diverse territories from fragmenting under the pressure of local ambitions and external threats. The business of governing leaves little time for the kind of extended philosophical speculation that had flourished during the early years of their marriage. The growing demands of statecraft begin to create tensions between Eleanor and Henry that echo, in some ways, the conflicts that had destroyed her first marriage. Henry's restless energy, which had once seemed so attractive, begins to manifest itself in ways that threaten the intellectual partnership that had been central to their relationship. His attention turns increasingly toward military campaigns and administrative reforms that leave little room for the kind of collaborative decision-making that Eleanor had come to expect as her right. Moreover, Henry's notorious infidelities, conducted with a carelessness that borders on public insult, violate not merely the traditional expectations of marriage, but the more sophisticated understanding of love and loyalty that Eleanor had been developing through her courts of love. The seeds that Eleanor had planted in the garden of medieval romance would grow into flowers both beautiful and dangerous, their perfume carrying across generations to intoxicate rulers who found themselves caught between the ancient demands of kingship and the newer, more perilous claims of the heart. As we move deeper into our quiet journey through the corridors of power, we encounter stories that unfold in chambers where the flicker of candlelight reveals faces marked by longing and the terrible weight of crowns that cannot be set aside, even for love. In the early years of the 14th century, when morning mist still clung to the battlements of English castles, and the sound of chapel bells drifted across courtyards where horses stamped impatiently in the dawn light, a young prince named Edward came to the throne of England carrying burdens that would prove too heavy for any man to bear alone. Edward II ascended to power in 1307, inheriting from his formidable father not only a kingdom, but expectations that seemed to press down upon his shoulders like armor forged from the hopes and fears of an entire realm. Picture the coronation ceremony in Westminster Abbey, where centuries of English kings had knelt before God and man to accept the sacred obligations of royal authority. The ancient stones rise around the assembled nobles like the walls of time itself, their surfaces worn smooth by countless ceremonies of power and submission. Incense drifts through air, heavy with the weight of tradition, while the deep voices of monks chanting Latin prayers create a sound that seems to emanate from the very foundations of the building. Yet even as young Edward kneels to receive the crown that will bind him to England's destiny, there are those among the assembled courtiers who notice something in his manner that sets him apart from the warrior kings who have preceded him. His attention seems to wander during the most solemn moments of the ceremony, his gaze finding and lingering upon a particular face among the crowd of nobles gathered to witness his transformation from prince to monarch. That face belongs to Piers Gaveston, a young Gascon knight whose presence at court has already begun to generate the kind of whispered speculation that spreads through royal households like smoke seeping through stone walls. Gaveston possesses the kind of beauty that seems almost feminine by the standards of medieval masculinity. Delicate features that might have belonged to one of the courtly ladies praised in troubadour songs, combined with an intelligence that manifests itself in wit sharp enough to cut through the formal protocols that usually govern court conversation. The relationship between Edward and Gaveston unfolds in the spaces between official ceremonies and state obligations, in those quiet hours when even kings can sometimes forget the weight of their crowns. They walk together through gardens where autumn leaves rustle underfoot and the last roses of the season release their perfume into air that carries the promise of winter. Their conversations, as recorded by court observers who struggle to understand what they are witnessing, range across subjects that seem to have little connection to the practical business of governing a medieval kingdom. They discuss poetry with a passion that Edward's father had reserved for military strategy. They debate questions of philosophy that would be more appropriate to a university lecture hall than a royal palace. Most dangerously of all, they speak to each other with the kind of easy intimacy that suggests a relationship that exists outside the careful hierarchies that govern all other interactions in the medieval world. The court watches these developments with the fascination of observers witnessing something unprecedented and potentially catastrophic. In chambers where the fire never quite banishes the chill that seems to seep up from stone floors, nobles gather to exchange observations delivered in voices barely above whispers. They note the way the king's entire demeanor changes when Gaveston enters a room, how his attention shifts from whatever matter of state he had been considering to focus entirely on his favorite's presence. They observe the gifts that flow from royal treasury to Gaveston's household. Robes of silk and velvet in colors reserved for royalty, jewels that had once belonged to Edward's ancestors, estates that carry with them the kind of wealth and prestige usually granted only to those who have proven themselves in battle or distinguished themselves through years of loyal service. But Gaveston's only service, as far as the court can determine, is the mysterious ability to make their king smile with genuine pleasure, a sight so rare that it seems almost miraculous to those who witness it. The marriage that political necessity imposes upon Edward creates a triangle of relationships that seems designed by fate to illustrate the dangerous complexities that arise when the medieval world's understanding of love and duty collide with the older, simpler certainties of dynastic obligation. Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV, and already known throughout Europe for beauty that seems to illuminate whatever chamber she enters, arrives in England in 1308 to fulfill the destiny that had been arranged for her before she was old enough to understand what marriage to a king would require. Picture her arrival at the English court, still young enough that her movements carry some of the unconscious grace of childhood, but already trained in the arts of royal presentation that will serve her throughout a life destined to be lived entirely in the public eye. Her gown, woven from silk that catches and reflects light like captured sunbeams, rustles softly as she moves through ceremonies designed to transform a French princess into an English queen. The crown placed upon her head weighs almost nothing compared to the expectations that settle around her shoulders like an invisible cloak. Isabella brings with her from France not only the diplomatic alliance that her marriage represents, but also the cultural sophistication that had made the French court the envy of Europe. She has been raised on the same traditions of courtly love that had once inspired Eleanor of Aquitaine, educated to expect that marriage, even royal marriage, might offer something more than mere political convenience. Her conversations sparkle with the kind of intellectual curiosity that had been nurtured in the libraries and salons of Paris, where the greatest minds of the age gathered to explore questions that ranged from theology to poetry to the subtle arts of human relationship. Yet from the very beginning of their marriage, Isabella finds herself competing not with another woman for her husband's affections, but with something far more difficult to understand or combat. Edward's attachment to Gaveston operates according to rules that seem to exist outside the traditional frameworks that govern medieval relationships. It is not the simple infatuation of a king for a beautiful mistress, which Isabella could have understood and perhaps even accommodated within the complex arrangements that royal marriages often required. Instead, she witnesses a connection that seems to engage every aspect of her husband's personality. His intellect, his emotions, his sense of humor, and his capacity for the kind of loyalty that should have been reserved for family and kingdom. Edward and Gaveston share jokes that exclude everyone else at court, exchange glances that carry entire conversations, and demonstrate a mutual understanding that seems to require no words at all. The isolation that Isabella experiences in her own palace becomes a kind of education in the loneliness that can exist at the very center of power and privilege. She sits in chambers decorated with tapestries that tell stories of legendary lovers, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who offer companionship but cannot provide the kind of intellectual and emotional partnership that she had been taught to expect from marriage. The conversations that swirl around her touch on court gossip and fashion, the management of household affairs, and the planning of religious observances, but never venture into the territories of genuine intimacy or shared purpose that she observes between her husband and his favorite. Meanwhile, the practical business of governing England proceeds with the kind of grinding inevitability that characterizes medieval administration, but Edward's attention to these duties becomes increasingly sporadic and half-hearted. Meetings of the royal council that should command his complete focus instead become opportunities for him to exchange meaningful glances with Gaveston across chambers where the most powerful men in England attempt to wrestle with problems that require sustained concentration and careful judgment. The barons who had served Edward's father with something approaching reverence find themselves dealing with a king who seems more interested in the company of his Gascon favorite than in the complex challenges of maintaining royal authority over a kingdom that encompasses not only England, but substantial territories in France and Wales. Their frustration manifests itself initially in the kind of grumbling that remains safely within the bounds of acceptable dissent, but gradually develops into something more organized and dangerous. Picture the meetings that begin to take place in manor houses scattered across the English countryside, where lords gather under the pretense of hunting or celebration, but actually come together to discuss their growing concerns about the direction of royal policy. These conversations unfold in chambers warmed by fires that cast dancing shadows on walls hung with weapons that speak of military traditions stretching back to the Norman conquest. The voices remain carefully modulated, never rising to levels that might be interpreted as treasonous, but the words they exchange carry implications that grow more serious with each gathering. The crisis comes to a head when the barons finally present Edward with an ultimatum that forces him to choose between his crown and his heart. The document they place before him in the Great Hall of Westminster Palace represents not merely a political demand, but a fundamental challenge to the romantic ideals that had been reshaping medieval culture since Eleanor of Aquitaine's time. They require him to banish Gaveston from England, to sever completely the relationship that has become the central organizing principle of his emotional life. Edward's response to this ultimatum reveals the terrible dilemma that faces any ruler who attempts to honor both the demands of kingship and the claims of personal affection. For months, he struggles to find some compromise that might satisfy his barons without destroying the relationship that has given meaning to his existence as a man, rather than merely as a political institution. He offers concessions on other matters of policy, attempts to redirect baronial attention toward foreign wars and domestic reforms, and tries desperately to demonstrate that his affection for Gaveston need not compromise his effectiveness as England's king. But the barons, perhaps understanding better than Edward himself, the revolutionary implications of allowing a king to prioritize personal relationships over political obligations, refuse to accept any solution that leaves Gaveston's influence intact. They recognize, with the instinct of men whose own power depends upon maintaining traditional hierarchies, that Edward's relationship with his favorite represents a fundamental challenge to the assumptions upon which medieval governance rests. The banishment of Gaveston unfolds like a funeral conducted for someone still living. Edward is forced to watch as the man whose companionship has become essential to his happiness prepares for exile to Ireland, a separation that both know may prove permanent despite the king's desperate promises of eventual reunion. The farewell scene, played out in the private chambers of the royal palace while courtiers maintain a respectful distance that cannot quite hide their fascination with this unprecedented drama, becomes a masterpiece of quiet anguish that will be remembered and whispered about for generations. Yet exile, as both Edward and Gaveston discover, cannot sever connections that have been forged in the furnace of genuine affection. Letters travel back and forth across the Irish Sea, carried by messengers who understand that their cargoes are worth more than gold to the men who send and receive them. These documents, written in hands that tremble with emotion, carefully controlled, speak of longing that grows stronger, rather than weaker, with distance and time. The language Edward uses to describe his separation from Gaveston draws heavily on the vocabulary of courtly love that had been developing throughout the medieval period. He writes of sleepless nights spent staring through windows that look out over waters that separate him from his heart's desire. He describes the way that even the most magnificent ceremonies of state seem empty and meaningless without Gaveston's presence to give them significance. Most dangerously of all, he begins to plan for a reunion that will require him to defy the very barons who had forced the separation in the first place. Gaveston's recall from exile represents Edward's declaration that love will triumph over political expediency, regardless of the consequences. The king's decision to bring his favorite back to England demonstrates either admirable courage or catastrophic foolishness, depending upon one's perspective on the relationship between personal happiness and royal responsibility. What cannot be disputed is that this choice sets in motion a sequence of events that will ultimately destroy them both. The reunion, when it finally occurs, takes place not in the public ceremony that might have demonstrated royal confidence in the decision, but in a private meeting that acknowledges the dangerous nature of what Edward has chosen to do. They meet in chambers where heavy curtains block the view from windows, where the only light comes from candles that cast more shadows than illumination, where even the servants who bring food and wine move with the careful silence of conspirators. Yet despite the secrecy that surrounds their reunion, word of Gaveston's return spreads through the English court like wildfire consuming dry timber. The barons who had believed their ultimatum had settled the matter permanently now find themselves confronting a king who has chosen to prioritize personal loyalty over political wisdom. Their response, when it comes, carries the finality of men who have decided that conventional methods of persuasion have proven insufficient to the crisis they face. The civil war that engulfs England in the aftermath of Gaveston's return unfolds with the terrible inevitability of a Greek tragedy, where every character's attempts to avoid disaster only make catastrophe more certain. Edward finds himself forced to defend not only his right to choose his own companions, but the more fundamental question of whether kings can be compelled to subordinate their personal relationships to the demands of political necessity. The military campaigns that follow reduce the abstract questions of love and loyalty to their most practical consequences. Armies march across English countryside, where spring flowers bloom in fields that will soon be watered with blood. Castle walls that had stood for centuries as symbols of permanent authority become strategic positions in a conflict that will determine whether medieval kingship can accommodate the kind of romantic idealism that had been spreading throughout European culture since Eleanor's time. But even as Edward struggles to defend his choices on the battlefield, other royal courts across Europe grapple with their own versions of the same fundamental conflict between heart and crown. In the kingdoms of Spain, where the influence of Arabic culture had created traditions of romantic poetry that rivaled anything produced in France or England, rulers find themselves caught between the old certainties of dynastic marriage and the newer, more dangerous possibilities of love that exists independently of political calculation. Pedro of Castile, who would earn the epithet the Cruel, through actions that seem to contradict the romantic idealism that actually motivated them, ascends to the throne of one of medieval Europe's most powerful kingdoms in 1350. His court, established in palaces that blend Christian and Islamic architectural traditions into something uniquely beautiful, becomes the setting for a love story that will ultimately tear apart not only his own kingdom, but the delicate balance of power that governs relationships between the Christian and Muslim worlds. The woman who captures Pedro's heart bears the name Maria de Padilla, and her beauty becomes legendary throughout a kingdom that has produced some of the most celebrated women in medieval history. Court poets struggle to find language adequate to describe the way she moves through chambers where light filters through windows designed by craftsmen who learned their art in the palaces of Cordoba and Granada. Her voice, when she speaks in the soft accent of southern Castile, seems to carry music that makes even bishops forget their sermons, and warriors lay aside their swords. But Maria possesses more than mere physical beauty. She has been educated in the traditions of learning that flourish in a kingdom where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars work together to preserve and extend human knowledge. Her conversations reveal a mind that can engage with questions of philosophy and theology, poetry and statecraft, with an intelligence that makes her companionship as valuable as her beauty is captivating. Pedro's marriage to Blanche of Bourbon, arranged to secure French support for Castilian foreign policy, becomes merely the formal backdrop against which his real emotional life unfolds. The wedding ceremony proceeds with all the magnificent display that befits the union of two of Europe's most powerful royal houses. But those who observe the king during these celebrations note that his attention seems to drift toward thoughts that have nothing to do with the political advantages his marriage is designed to secure. Within months of his official wedding, Pedro establishes Maria in apartments within the royal palace that effectively make her a second queen, though one whose authority derives from love rather than legal sanction. The arrangement scandalizes those who believe that royal marriage should create clear and unambiguous lines of succession, but Pedro demonstrates the same indifference to conventional opinion that had characterized Edward II's relationship with Gaveston. The children born to Pedro and Maria create a succession crisis that will plague Castile for generations. Each birth represents both a personal joy for the royal couple and a political catastrophe for a kingdom that depends upon clear hereditary succession to maintain stability. The boys who carry their father's blood but not their mother's legal status grow up in a palace where they are simultaneously beloved and illegitimate. Princes who might inherit a kingdom or might find themselves exiled depending upon the changing currents of political fortune. Meanwhile, Blanche of Bourbon, the legal queen whose marriage was supposed to anchor Castilian foreign policy, finds herself imprisoned in circumstances that make Isabella of France's isolation seem mild by comparison. Pedro confines his wife to remote castles where she spends years surrounded by guards who serve more as jailers than protectors. Her existence acknowledged only when diplomatic necessity requires some formal gesture toward the marriage that theoretically governs Castilian succession. The tragedy that eventually destroys Pedro and Maria unfolds against the backdrop of the broader European conflicts that will shape the late medieval period. The 100 Years' War between England and France creates opportunities for ambitious nobles to seek foreign support for their domestic rebellions, while the continuing presence of Muslim kingdoms in southern Spain provides additional complications for rulers who must balance religious obligation against political pragmatism. Pedro's half-brother Enrique of Trastamara emerges as the focus for opposition to a king whose romantic choices are seen as evidence of unfitness for royal authority. Enrique's supporters include not only Castilian nobles who disapprove of Pedro's treatment of his legal wife, but also French forces eager to prevent English influence from spreading into the Iberian Peninsula. The civil war that results transforms questions of love and legitimacy into matters of life and death for everyone involved. The Siege of Montiel, where Pedro makes his final stand against the forces led by his half-brother, becomes the setting for the last act of one of medieval Europe's most tragic love stories. The castle walls that surround the royal couple and their supporters grow smaller each day as Enrique's forces tighten their grip around the stronghold that has become both fortress and prison. Inside those contracting walls, Pedro and Maria spend their final weeks together in chambers, where the sound of enemy weapons mingles with the gentle music that had once accompanied their courtship. They know that capture means death for Pedro and probably exile for Maria, yet the conversations recorded by those who witness these final days speak not of regret for choices made, but of gratitude for years of happiness that most rulers never experience. The end, when it comes, arrives with the swift brutality that characterizes medieval warfare. Pedro dies not in formal battle, but in personal combat with Enrique, a confrontation that reduces decades of political conflict to its most elemental form. Two brothers fighting with knives in the dirt outside a besieged castle, their struggle representing not only rival claims to a throne, but fundamentally different understandings of what kingship should require of those who wear crowns. Maria survives her lover's death by only a few years, spending her remaining time in convents where nuns who had never experienced romantic love nevertheless recognized something sacred in her grief. The letters she writes during this period, composed in a hand that grows increasingly shaky as illness takes its toll, speak of a love that transcends the political calculations that had made it impossible and dangerous. Yet, even as these individual tragedies play out in the courts of England and Castile, the ideas about love and royal authority that had inspired them continue to spread throughout medieval Europe, like seeds scattered by wind that will take root in unexpected places. The stories of Edward and Gaveston, of Pedro and Maria, become cautionary tales told in some courts and romantic inspiration in others, depending upon the listener's own understanding of the relationship between personal happiness and political responsibility. In the courts of France, where the traditions of courtly love had first taken root, Eleanor of Aquitaine's intellectual descendants watched the unfolding disasters in England and Spain with the fascination of scholars observing experimental results. Some conclude that the attempt to reconcile romantic love with royal duty represents a dangerous folly that threatens the foundations of medieval civilization. Others argue that the tragedies result not from the attempt itself, but from the inadequate imagination of societies not yet ready to accommodate the new possibilities that love represents. The debates that rage in chambers where philosophers gather by candlelight to explore the implications of these royal love stories touch on questions that will continue to shape European culture for centuries to come. Can governments founded on inherited authority survive the introduction of romantic choice into royal marriage? Do rulers have the right to prioritize personal happiness over dynastic obligation? What happens to the concept of divine right when kings and queens demonstrate that they are subject to the same emotional needs and desires that govern their subjects' lives? These conversations, conducted in voices that never rise above the level appropriate to scholarly discussion, nevertheless carry revolutionary implications that will ultimately transform not only how Europeans think about monarchy, but how they understand the relationship between individual desire and social order. The stories of royal lovers who chose their hearts over their crowns become part of a larger cultural transformation that will eventually produce new forms of government, new concepts of human rights, and new understandings of what it means to live a life worthy of the dignity that philosophers are beginning to recognize as the birthright of every human soul. In the quiet hours that follow midnight, when even the most vigilant guards allow their attention to wander, and the corridors of power echo with nothing but the whisper of wind through ancient stones, transformations begin that will reshape kingdoms and topple thrones. Our story now turns to a woman whose heart, once offered in hope and gradually hardened by neglect, would become the instrument of a revolution so complete that historians would struggle for centuries to understand how love scorned could wield such terrible power. Isabella of France, whom we encountered earlier as a young bride, full of hope and French sophistication, had spent years learning lessons that no royal education had prepared her to master. In chambers where morning light filtered through windows that looked out over English countryside, she would never truly call home. She had discovered that queens, no matter how beautiful or intelligent or well-born, could be made invisible by husbands whose hearts belonged elsewhere. Picture her, during those long years of Edward's infatuation with Gaveston, sitting in solar chambers, where tapestries depicted legendary lovers whose stories seemed to mock her own experience. The needle moves through silk with the rhythm of someone who has learned to find occupation for hands, while minds wander through territories of increasing darkness. Her ladies-in-waiting, French women who had followed her across the Channel, expecting to find themselves at the center of court life, instead discover that their mistress's isolation extends to encompass everyone associated with her. The conversations that fill these chambers during the endless afternoons take on the quality of whispered conspiracies, though they begin innocently enough. Isabella's attendants speak of letters from France, of relatives and friends whose lives continue to unfold in the sophisticated atmosphere of the court they had left behind. They describe festivities and ceremonies, diplomatic triumphs and cultural achievements, painting pictures of a world where queens matter and royal marriages serve purposes more meaningful than mere political convenience. As years pass and Isabella's isolation deepens, these conversations begin to take on darker undertones. The women who serve her start to notice details that accumulate like drops of water, eventually wearing away stone. They observe how Edward's face never brightens when his queen enters a room, how his conversations with her never extend beyond the basic courtesies that protocol requires, how he listens to her opinions with the polite indifference one might show to a servant offering unnecessary information. More painfully, they witness the way Edward's entire being seems to come alive in Gaveston's presence, how his laughter rings through halls where it never sounds when Isabella attempts to engage his attention. They see the gifts that flow from royal coffers to Gaveston's household, while Isabella must request permission for expenditures that other queens would consider routine. They watch as the king and his favorite develop private jokes and shared references that exclude everyone else, creating an intimacy that makes Isabella feel like a stranger in her own palace. The birth of Isabella's children provides temporary respites from this isolation, moments when Edward's attention focuses on her with something approaching genuine interest. The future Edward III arrives in 1312, followed by John of England, Eleanor, and Joan, each birth celebrated with the ceremonies appropriate to royal offspring, but never quite bridging the emotional distance that separates their parents. During these brief interludes, Isabella glimpses what her marriage might have become under different circumstances. Edward, holding his infant son or daughter, sometimes looks at her with expressions that suggest recognition of her value as something more than a diplomatic inconvenience. In these moments, she sees traces of the man who might have become her intellectual companion and emotional partner, had his heart not been claimed by another before she arrived in England. But these glimpses of possibility make the return to routine neglect even more painful. As each child grows old enough to require less immediate attention, Edward's focus drifts back toward Gaveston, leaving Isabella to manage the complex responsibilities of royal motherhood without the kind of partnership that makes such burdens bearable. She finds herself raising the future King of England in chambers where the absent father's love is reserved for someone who can never provide England with legitimate heirs. The death of Gaveston at the hands of rebellious barons in 1312 initially seems to offer hope for Isabella's marriage, but she discovers that grief can create walls even higher than infatuation had built. Edward's mourning takes on a quality of romantic devotion that transforms his dead favorite into a martyr whose memory becomes more powerful than his living presence had ever been. The king who had been merely indifferent to his queen becomes actively resentful of anyone whose continued existence seems to mock his loss. Isabella watches her husband retreat into a world of memories and regrets that excludes her more completely than Gaveston's physical presence ever had. Edward spends hours in chambers where he keeps relics of his lost love, letters written in a familiar hand, garments that still carry traces of a beloved scent, items of jewelry that had been given and received as tokens of affection that Isabella had never been permitted to share. The arrival of Hugh Despencer the Younger at court represents a new chapter in Isabella's education in the varieties of romantic exclusion. Despencer, recognizing the opportunity that Gaveston's death has created, positions himself as heir to the dead favorite's influence over the king. But where Gaveston had possessed genuine charm and intelligence that made his hold over Edward at least comprehensible, Despencer brings only ambition wrapped in a superficial attractiveness that fools no one except the king desperate to fill the void in his heart. Isabella observes this new relationship with the cold clarity that comes from years of studying the dynamics of royal exclusion. She recognizes that Despencer's power derives not from Edward's love, but from his loneliness, a distinction that makes the situation even more humiliating for a queen who had once hoped to win her husband's affection through her own merits. She is being ignored not for someone worthy of preference, but for someone whose only qualification is his willingness to provide Edward with the illusion of the companionship he has lost. Under Despencer's influence, Edward's treatment of Isabella becomes not merely neglectful, but actively hostile. The new favorite apparently views the queen as a potential threat to his position and encourages Edward to see her French connections as evidence of divided loyalty rather than valuable diplomatic assets. Isabella finds herself subjected to scrutiny that borders on surveillance, her correspondence monitored, and her movements restricted in ways that transform her from neglected wife into virtual prisoner. The transformation of Isabella from patient victim to dangerous enemy begins in the quiet spaces between these humiliations, in moments of solitude where years of accumulated pain crystallize into something harder and more focused than mere resentment. She starts to notice things that had escaped her attention during the years when she still hoped that patience and virtue might eventually win her husband's regard. She observes how Edward's neglect of governmental responsibilities has created opportunities for those willing to exploit royal weakness. She sees how Despencer's rapacious ambition has made enemies among nobles who might have remained loyal to a king who governed with wisdom and justice. Most importantly, she begins to understand that her position as Edward's queen, which had seemed like a source of powerlessness, might actually provide her with resources that could be turned to purposes Edward has never imagined. The crisis that finally pushes Isabella beyond the boundaries of patient endurance arrives in 1325, when Edward sends her to France to negotiate with her brother Charles IV over disputed territories in Gascony. The mission itself represents a grudging acknowledgement of Isabella's diplomatic value, but Edward's motives have more to do with removing her from England than with utilizing her skills as a negotiator. The journey across the English Channel becomes a passage between worlds for Isabella, who has not seen France for nearly 2 decades. As her ship moves through waters that reflect the changing light of an autumn sky, she feels something inside herself shifting like ballast, finding a new equilibrium. The woman who had learned to make herself small and unobtrusive in Edward's court begins to remember what it felt like to be valued for her intelligence and appreciated for her contributions to the sophisticated conversations that had filled her youth. The French court welcomes Isabella with a warmth that makes her years of isolation in England seem even more cruel by comparison. Her brother Charles greets her not as a diplomatic inconvenience, but as a beloved sister whose counsel he values and whose company he has genuinely missed. The conversations that fill the chambers of the royal palace in Paris touch on subjects that range from statecraft to philosophy, from poetry to theology, all conducted with the assumption that Isabella's opinions are worth hearing and her insights worth considering. In this atmosphere of intellectual respect and emotional warmth, Isabella begins to rediscover aspects of her personality that had been suppressed by years of trying to win affection from a husband who had no interest in what she had to offer. She finds herself engaging in debates about governance and diplomacy with a confidence that surprises even her, as if skills that had been dormant during her English exile were suddenly awakening to new possibilities. It is during these weeks of rediscovery that Isabella encounters Roger Mortimer, and their meeting sets in motion events that will ultimately topple the English throne and reshape the relationship between personal desire and political power throughout medieval Europe. Mortimer recently escaped from the Tower of London, where Edward had imprisoned him for his role in opposing royal policies, arrives at the French court as a refugee seeking support for his continued resistance to English royal authority. The man Isabella meets bears little resemblance to the conventional image of a medieval rebel. Mortimer possesses the kind of sophisticated intelligence that had been cultivated in the borderlands between England and Wales, where survival required not only military skill, but also the ability to navigate complex relationships between competing loyalties and interests. His conversations reveal a mind that can engage with questions of law and governance, military strategy and diplomatic finesse, with an expertise that comes from years of practical experience in the arts of both war and peace. More importantly, for Isabella's emotional development, Mortimer treats her with the kind of respect that she had almost forgotten was possible. He listens to her opinions about English politics with the attention of someone who recognizes that her years of observation from within Edward's court have given her insights that no external observer could possess. He seeks her advice about matters of strategy and timing, with the assumption that her intelligence and judgment are valuable resources rather than inconvenient complications. The relationship that develops between Isabella and Mortimer unfolds in the spaces between official diplomatic meetings and court ceremonies, in gardens where late roses bloom despite the approaching winter, and in chambers where firelight creates an atmosphere of intimacy that both find intoxicating after years of emotional isolation. Their conversations, which begin as consultations about the practical problems of opposing Edward's government, gradually evolve into something more personal and dangerous. Isabella discovers that she can speak to Mortimer about her years of loneliness and humiliation without fear of judgment or dismissal. He listens to her descriptions of Edward's treatment with an anger that validates her own feelings while never suggesting that her pain is unimportant or self-inflicted. For the first time since her arrival in England, Isabella finds herself in the company of someone who seems to value not only her political usefulness, but also her emotional well-being. Mortimer, for his part, recognizes in Isabella not only a potential ally against Edward's regime, but also a woman whose intelligence and strength of character have been shaped by adversities that would have destroyed weaker personalities. Her years of patient endurance in circumstances that might have driven others to despair or madness have created reserves of determination that he finds both admirable and useful for the plans that are beginning to form in his mind. The transformation of their political alliance into something more intimate occurs gradually through a series of conversations and shared confidences that create bonds deeper than mere strategic cooperation. Isabella finds herself looking forward to their meetings with an anticipation that has nothing to do with the diplomatic objectives that provide their official justification. She begins to choose her clothing with care that she has not exercised in years, to pay attention to details of appearance and manner that had seemed pointless during her years of invisibility in Edward's court. Their first kiss, when it finally occurs, takes place in a chamber where the last light of winter afternoon filters through windows that look out over gardens where bare branches create intricate patterns against the darkening sky. The moment itself seems to crystallize years of accumulated longing and frustration into something that feels both inevitable and revolutionary. For Isabella, it represents not only the discovery of romantic love, but also the recognition that she possesses power that can be exercised through means that Edward has never imagined. The conspiracy that Isabella and Mortimer begin to plan during those winter months in Paris represents more than a simple rebellion against Edward's authority. It embodies a fundamental challenge to the assumptions about gender and power that govern medieval political relationships. Isabella's decision to use her position as queen, not to support her husband's regime, but to destroy it, demonstrates a form of female agency that has few precedents in medieval history. The preparations for their return to England unfold with the careful attention to detail that characterizes successful revolutions. Isabella uses her diplomatic mission as cover for recruiting support among English exiles in France, while Mortimer employs his military experience to develop strategies for a campaign that will need to succeed quickly or face the overwhelming resources that Edward can deploy once he recognizes the threat he faces. But the most revolutionary aspect of their planning lies in the way they envision Isabella's role in the coming conflict. Rather than remaining safely in France while Mortimer leads military operations in England, Isabella insists on returning to her adopted country as an active participant in the rebellion against her husband. This decision reflects not only her commitment to their shared cause, but also her understanding that her presence will transform their military campaign into something unprecedented. A revolution led by a queen against her own husband. The invasion of England in September 1326 begins not with the dramatic flourishes that characterize most military campaigns, but with the quiet competence of conspirators who have planned every detail with meticulous care. Isabella and Mortimer land at Harwich with a small force that includes her son, the future Edward III, whose presence transforms their rebellion into something that can claim legitimacy as a movement to protect the rightful heir from the corrupting influence of his father's favorites. The response to Isabella's return reveals the extent to which Edward's misgovernment has alienated the natural supporters of royal authority. Rather than rallying to defend their king against foreign invasion, English nobles flock to Isabella's banner with an enthusiasm that suggests they have been waiting for someone to provide them with an alternative to Edward's continued rule. The military campaign that follows unfolds with a speed that surprises even Isabella and Mortimer. Town after town opens its gates to the invading queen, while Edward's supporters melt away like snow before the spring sun. The king himself, accompanied by Despenser and a rapidly shrinking band of loyalists retreats westward toward Wales in what becomes less a strategic withdrawal than a desperate flight from the consequences of years of misrule. Yet even as military success exceeds their most optimistic expectations, Isabella and Mortimer discover that the personal dimensions of their revolution prove more complex than its political aspects. The relationship that had developed between them in the relatively safe environment of the French court must now function under the pressures of an active military campaign, where every decision carries life or death consequences for thousands of people. Isabella finds herself required to make choices that test the limits of her determination to prioritize personal fulfillment over traditional obligations. The woman who had once hoped only to win her husband's affection must now decide whether to order his capture, imprisonment, or death. The queen who had spent years longing for Edward's attention must now demonstrate that she is prepared to destroy him in order to protect the relationship that has given her life new meaning. The capture of Edward II near Neath Abbey in November 1326 brings Isabella face to face with the man whose neglect had transformed her from hopeful bride into vengeful queen. The meeting between estranged husband and victorious wife takes place in circumstances that strip away all the ceremonial dignity that had once surrounded their interactions, leaving only the raw human emotions that years of mutual injury have created. Edward, reduced from king to prisoner, regards Isabella with a mixture of bewilderment and resentment that suggests he has never understood how his treatment of her might have created the determination that has led to his downfall. His questions focus on her motivations rather than her grievances, as if he genuinely cannot comprehend how years of indifference and humiliation might have transformed love into something more dangerous than hatred. Isabella's responses, delivered in a voice that remains controlled despite the emotional turbulence that must be raging beneath her composed exterior, reveal the extent to which her relationship with Mortimer has changed not only her political priorities, but also her understanding of her own worth. She speaks to Edward not as a wife seeking reconciliation, but as a conqueror explaining the terms of surrender to a defeated enemy. The months that follow Edward's capture see Isabella exercise power in ways that demonstrate how completely she has abandoned the role of patient, suffering queen that had defined her identity for so many years. Working in partnership with Mortimer, she orchestrates Edward's abdication in favor of their son, creating a regency that allows them to govern England in all but name, while maintaining the legal fiction that the crown remains within the Plantagenet line. The administrative documents that flow from this new government bear Isabella's seal alongside Mortimer's, evidence of a partnership that operates according to principles of equality that have few precedents in medieval governance. Their joint signatures appear on treaties and proclamations, land grants, and judicial decisions, creating a record of shared authority that reflects the personal relationship that has made their political cooperation possible. But the most remarkable aspect of Isabella's transformation lies not in her exercise of political power, but in the confidence with which she has learned to claim emotional fulfillment as a legitimate priority for someone in her position. The woman who had once hoped desperately for crumbs of affection from an indifferent husband now expects and receives the kind of romantic devotion that troubadours had sung about, but that few real queens had ever experienced. The court that Isabella and Mortimer establish at Westminster bears little resemblance to the sterile environment that had characterized Edward's reign. Their chambers become gathering places for conversations that range across subjects from military strategy to romantic poetry, from diplomatic negotiations to philosophical speculation about the nature of love and loyalty. The atmosphere they create suggests that political power need not require the sacrifice of personal happiness, that effective governance might actually benefit from the energy and creativity that romantic fulfillment can provide. Yet even as Isabella enjoys the fruits of her romantic and political triumph, the seeds of future tragedy are already taking root in the very success that seems to vindicate all her choices. The relationship that had flourished in the circumstances of conspiracy and rebellion must now function within the more complex environment of established power, where different pressures and temptations will test bonds that had seemed unbreakable when forged in the crucible of shared danger. The whispered conversations that begin to circulate through the court speak of concerns that grow more serious with each passing month. Some voices express unease about the precedent that Isabella's actions have established, wondering whether the successful rebellion of one queen against her husband might encourage other royal wives to challenge the traditional assumptions about marriage and obedience that govern medieval society. Other whispers focus on more immediate concerns about the ways in which Isabella and Mortimer's relationship affects their judgment about matters of policy and personnel. Critics suggest that their romantic partnership has created a closed circle of decision-making that excludes valuable advice and alternative perspectives, leading to choices that serve their personal interests rather than the broader needs of the kingdom they govern. Most dangerously, voices begin to question whether the young Edward III, now approaching his majority, will be content to remain indefinitely under the regency that his mother and her lover have established. The prince who had once served as a justification for rebellion against his father's misrule is growing into a man who might develop his own ideas about how England should be governed and who should exercise ultimate authority over its policies and resources. Isabella, walking through gardens where spring flowers are beginning to bloom despite the chill that still lingers in the air, must sometimes pause to consider how completely her life has been transformed by the choices she made during those crucial months in France. The woman who had once measured her days by the small gestures of attention or indifference that Edward had chosen to bestow upon her now finds herself wielding power that extends across kingdoms and shaping policies that will influence generations of English subjects. Yet the satisfaction that comes from this transformation remains complicated by the knowledge that every choice she has made has carried costs that continue to accumulate like debts that will eventually require payment. The love that has given her life new meaning has also made her vulnerable to accusations and attacks that no amount of political success can entirely deflect. The power that has freed her from the humiliations of her marriage has also created new forms of isolation and responsibility that sometimes feel as burdensome as the neglect she had endured as Edward's queen. In the quiet hours when even lovers must sometimes wrestle with private doubts and fears, Isabella finds herself remembering the young woman who had arrived in England with such hope and optimism, believing that marriage to a king would provide opportunities for the kind of partnership and shared purpose that the troubadours had made seem not only possible but natural. That earlier version of herself seems like someone from a different lifetime, someone whose innocence about the realities of power and love had been both beautiful and naive. The woman she has become through years of disappointment and eventual triumph understands truths about the relationship between personal desire and political authority that her younger self could never have imagined. She has learned that love scorned can become a force more powerful than armies, that patience too long sustained can transform into determination capable of toppling thrones, and that queens who refuse to accept the limitations that others try to impose upon their hearts can reshape the world according to their own vision of what life should offer to those brave enough to claim it. The threads of love and power that Isabella had woven into the fabric of English politics would spread across the waters of the Channel like ripples from a stone cast into still water, carrying with them the seeds of conflicts that would entangle kingdoms for generations to come. As we continue our gentle journey through the corridors where hearts and crowns collide, we find ourselves witness to a truth that medieval rulers learned too late: that love recognizes no borders, while the consequences of royal romance respect no boundaries between nations. In the chambers of Sheen Palace, where the young Richard II came of age amid tapestries that depicted the legendary lovers of antiquity, the lessons of his grandmother Isabella's triumph over Edward II had been absorbed with the thoroughness that only childhood observation can achieve. Richard, crowned at the tender age of 10 in 1377, grew to manhood surrounded by the whispered stories of how a queen's wounded heart had toppled a throne and reshaped a kingdom. The boy who would become one of England's most controversial monarchs learned early that love could be both salvation and destruction, depending upon how skillfully it was wielded by those brave enough to claim it as their right. Picture the young king during those formative years, moving through chambers where the afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows creates patterns of color that shift and change, like the political alliances that will define his turbulent reign. His tutors, men chosen for their learning rather than their understanding of the human heart, attempt to educate him in the traditional arts of kingship, the management of resources, the deployment of military force, the delicate negotiations that maintain peace between competing interests. Yet Richard's attention often wanders toward the more dangerous territories explored by the court poets and musicians who gather in alcoves where their voices weave melodies that speak of longings that have little to do with the practical business of governance. The atmosphere of Richard's court, shaped by influences that would have scandalized his great-grandfather Edward I, encourages the kind of romantic idealism that treats personal happiness as a legitimate goal for even the most exalted rulers. The conversations that fill the royal chambers during the long winter evenings range across subjects that earlier generations would have considered inappropriate for serious consideration. Courtiers debate whether a king's marriage should serve primarily political or personal purposes, whether romantic love might actually strengthen rather than weaken royal authority, and whether the pursuit of individual fulfillment might be compatible with the sacred obligations that come with wearing a crown. These discussions, conducted in voices that never rise above the respectful murmur appropriate to royal presence, nevertheless carry revolutionary implications that extend far beyond the borders of England. The ideas being explored in Richard's court, that marriage might be a partnership between equals, that personal compatibility might matter more than diplomatic advantage, that emotional fulfillment might be worth the risk of political complications, represent challenges to assumptions that govern not only English royal practice, but the marriage policies of every European dynasty. The first crisis to test these theoretical discussions arrives in 1382, when Richard reaches marriageable age, and the great noble families of Europe begin positioning their daughters as potential queens of England. The negotiations that swirl around the 17-year-old king create a marketplace of possibility, where dowries are weighed against territorial advantages, where family bloodlines are analyzed with the precision of military strategists planning campaigns, and where the personal preferences of the royal groom are treated as one factor among many in calculations that will reshape the map of medieval Europe. Yet Richard, perhaps influenced by the stories of Isabella's eventual triumph over those who had tried to constrain her choices, demonstrates an independence that alarms his advisors and delights the court poets who have encouraged his romantic idealism. Rather than accepting the bride who offers the greatest political advantages, he chooses Anne of Bohemia, daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, a selection that confounds the expectations of those who had assumed that English royal marriage policy would focus on strengthening alliances with France or securing advantages in the ongoing conflicts that periodically erupted along England's northern and western borders. Anne arrives in England in January 1382, traveling through winter landscapes where frost turns bare branches into crystalline sculptures that catch and reflect the pale sunlight of the shortest days. Her journey from Prague to London becomes a procession through territories where the very concept of royal marriage is being redefined by a generation that has grown up hearing stories of queens who chose their own destinies and kings who prioritized personal happiness over political convenience. The wedding ceremony itself, conducted in Westminster Abbey on a day when snow falls softly beyond the ancient windows, represents more than the union of two young people whose lives have been shaped by forces beyond their control. The vows exchanged between Richard and Anne carry implications that extend across the networks of diplomacy and alliance that connect medieval Europe like threads in an intricate tapestry. Their marriage signals England's willingness to look beyond the traditional partnerships that had governed royal policy for centuries, opening possibilities for new forms of international cooperation while creating potential complications that no one can fully anticipate. But the most remarkable aspect of Richard and Anne's relationship lies not in its political implications, but in the genuine affection that develops between two young people who discover that royal marriage need not be merely a business arrangement between families. Court observers note the way Richard's face brightens when Anne enters a room, how their conversations extend far beyond the formal exchanges that protocol requires, how they seem to find genuine pleasure in each other's company, even when no audience is present to witness their interactions. Anne brings to the English court not only the diplomatic connections that her marriage represents, but also intellectual traditions that have flourished in the cosmopolitan environment of Prague, where influences from Germany, Italy, and the eastern reaches of Europe mingle to create a cultural sophistication that rivals anything found in Paris or London. Her conversations reveal a mind educated in the latest developments in philosophy and theology, poetry and music, natural philosophy and the subtle arts of governance that her father had employed to hold together the diverse territories of the Holy Roman Empire. The partnership that develops between Richard and Anne creates a model of royal marriage that influences courts throughout Europe, demonstrating that political advantage and personal happiness need not be mutually exclusive goals. Their joint participation in ceremonial occasions, their collaborative approach to patronage of arts and learning, and their obvious mutual devotion provide evidence that supports the romantic idealism that troubadours and court poets have been promoting for nearly 2 centuries. Yet even as Richard and Anne's marriage flourishes within the protected environment of the English court, the broader political consequences of their union begin to manifest themselves in ways that neither could have anticipated. The alliance with Bohemia that their marriage represents draws England into the complex web of relationships that govern Central European politics, creating obligations and opportunities that will ultimately contribute to conflicts that extend far beyond the original scope of their personal choice. The death of Anne of Bohemia in 1394, when she is still only 28 years old, transforms Richard from a king whose romantic idealism had seemed charming and harmless into a man whose grief becomes a force capable of reshaping international relations. The loss of the woman who had been not only his queen but also his intellectual companion and emotional anchor creates a void in Richard's life that no amount of political success can fill. Court observers describe the king during the months following Anne's death as a man whose very presence seems to cast shadows even in the brightest chambers. He moves through the daily ceremonies and obligations of royal life with the mechanical precision of someone fulfilling duties that have lost all personal meaning. The conversations that had once sparkled with wit and philosophical speculation become formal exchanges focused solely on the immediate requirements of governmental business. More dangerously for the future of Anglo-French relations, Richard's grief begins to manifest itself in a desperate search for some form of consolation that might restore meaning to his existence as both king and man. The advisors who had once worried about his romantic idealism now find themselves dealing with a ruler whose emotional needs create vulnerabilities that foreign powers are eager to exploit. The French court, recognizing an opportunity to advance its own interests while exploiting Richard's psychological weakness, begins a careful campaign to present marriage alliance as the solution to both his personal anguish and England's diplomatic isolation. The negotiations that follow Anne's death unfold in chambers where candlelight creates an atmosphere of intimate conspiracy, where French ambassadors speak in voices designed to suggest that they offer not merely political advantage, but also the possibility of emotional healing. The woman they propose as Richard's second wife is Isabel of Valois, daughter of Charles VI of France, a child of 6 whose marriage to the English king would seal a peace treaty between kingdoms that have been at war for more than half a century. The alliance that this marriage would represent promises to end the conflicts that have consumed vast resources and countless lives, creating possibilities for prosperity and cultural exchange that seem almost too magnificent to be real. Yet the very terms of this marriage proposal reveal the extent to which Richard's emotional vulnerability has compromised his political judgment. The French negotiators, understanding that the grieving king is more susceptible to romantic fantasy than hard political calculation, present their offer not as a cold diplomatic arrangement, but as an opportunity for Richard to find new love while simultaneously achieving lasting glory as the king who brought peace to England and France. Richard's acceptance of this proposal represents one of the most consequential decisions in medieval European history, though its full implications will not become clear for generations. The marriage treaty signed in 1396 establishes not only a personal union between the English king and the French princess, but also a complex web of obligations and expectations that will influence Anglo-French relations for centuries to come. The wedding ceremony, conducted with magnificence that demonstrates both kingdoms' commitment to their new alliance, takes place in the Cathedral of St. Omer in October 1396. The 8-year-old bride stands beside her 30-year-old husband in chambers where the autumn light filtering through stained glass windows creates patterns that seem to bless their union, while simultaneously suggesting the fragility of arrangements that depend upon the continuation of circumstances that can change without warning. Yet even as Richard and Isabel exchange vows that bind their kingdoms together in peace, the seeds of future conflict are already beginning to germinate in the very success of their diplomatic marriage. The treaty that makes their union possible requires Richard to surrender territories that previous English kings had claimed as their rightful inheritance, creating resentments among English nobles who view these concessions as betrayals of England's historic rights and interests. More subtly but ultimately more dangerously, the marriage alliance with France aligns England with one side in a conflict that extends far beyond the traditional boundaries of Anglo-French rivalry. The political arrangements that make peace between England and France possible simultaneously draw both kingdoms into the complex web of relationships that govern European politics during an era when the Great Schism has divided the Christian world between competing claims to papal authority. The papal politics that surround Richard's marriage to Isabel of Valois illustrate how royal romance can become entangled with religious conflicts in ways that create consequences extending far beyond the original scope of personal choice. The French court's support for the Avignon papacy, while England's traditional allegiances lie with Rome, means that Richard's marriage requires him to navigate theological disputes that have implications for his relationships with noble families throughout Europe. These religious complications manifest themselves most clearly in Richard's dealings with the Portuguese royal family, where his marriage alliance with France creates tensions that illustrate how love and politics can become so intertwined that personal choices inevitably carry international consequences. John I of Portugal, who had relied upon English support in his conflicts with Castile, finds himself isolated by Richard's new French alliance, creating resentments that will influence Iberian politics for generations. The marriage negotiations between the Portuguese and English royal families that had been proceeding before Richard's French alliance provide a case study in how royal romance can reshape continental politics through chains of cause and effect that extend far beyond the original participants. Philippa of Lancaster, daughter of John of Gaunt, had been proposed as a potential bride for John I of Portugal, as part of diplomatic arrangements designed to strengthen English influence in Iberian affairs. When Richard's French marriage makes these Portuguese connections politically awkward, the resulting diplomatic complications create opportunities for Castilian and French influences to expand into territories where English interests had previously been dominant. The ripple effects of Richard's romantic choice thus contribute to a realignment of European alliances that will influence the development of exploration and colonization efforts that ultimately reshape the global balance of power. But the most immediate consequences of Richard's marriage to Isabel of Valois manifest themselves within England itself, where nobles who had supported the French alliance as a path to peace discover that their king's romantic choices have created new forms of political vulnerability. The very youth of Richard's bride, which had initially seemed to promise years of stability and cooperation between England and France, gradually becomes a source of embarrassment and criticism as courtiers begin to question the appropriateness of a marriage that seems more like guardianship than genuine partnership. The absence of children from Richard's second marriage creates succession concerns that had not existed during his union with Anne of Bohemia. Court observers note that the king's relationship with his child bride lacks the intellectual companionship and emotional intimacy that had characterized his first marriage, leaving him increasingly isolated despite his theoretical success in achieving the diplomatic objectives that his advisors had promoted. This isolation manifests itself in Richard's growing dependence upon a small circle of favorites, whose influence over royal policy begins to replicate the patterns that had proved so disastrous during the reign of Edward II. The parallels between Richard's reliance on advisors like Robert de Vere and Michael de la Pole and his predecessor's attachment to Gaveston and the Despensers become too obvious for contemporary observers to ignore. The rebellion that eventually destroys Richard's reign in 1399 represents the culmination of tensions that began with his romantic choices but extended to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between royal authority and noble consent. Henry Bolingbroke's successful challenge to Richard's throne draws support from nobles who view the king's marriage policy as evidence of judgment so flawed that it disqualifies him from continued rule. Yet, the deposition of Richard II creates international complications that demonstrate how completely his romantic choices had become entangled with European politics. The French court's response to the overthrow of their royal son-in-law transforms what might have remained an internal English dispute into a diplomatic crisis that threatens to reignite the warfare that Richard's marriage had been designed to prevent. Young Isabel of Valois, now a widow at the age of 11, becomes the focus of negotiations that illustrate how royal women can find themselves transformed into diplomatic pawns by political changes that they have no power to influence. The French demands for her return to France, along with the restoration of her dowry and the territories that had been promised as part of her marriage settlement, create obligations that the new English government finds difficult to fulfill without appearing to submit to foreign pressure. The resolution of these complications requires Henry IV, the new English king, to navigate diplomatic waters that have been made treacherous by his predecessor's romantic choices. The marriage alliances that Richard had used to secure peace with France become sources of continuing tension that complicate English foreign policy for decades to come. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the French court's analysis of Richard's overthrow contributes to a growing understanding of how royal marriage policy can be used as a weapon in international conflicts. The lessons learned from the English crisis influence French diplomatic strategy in ways that will ultimately contribute to the outbreak of new conflicts that make Richard's peace treaties seem like mere interludes in a much longer and more complex struggle for European dominance. The marriage of Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois, to Henry V of England in 1420 represents the culmination of a diplomatic process that began with the romantic entanglements of Richard II's reign. The Treaty of Troyes that makes this marriage possible attempts to resolve the succession crisis created by Charles VI's periodic bouts of madness by making Henry V the heir to the French throne, a solution that transforms a marriage alliance into a plan for dynastic union that would eliminate the fundamental source of Anglo-French conflict. Yet the very ambition of this diplomatic marriage contains the seeds of its own failure. The attempt to unite the crowns of England and France through the romantic bond between Henry and Catherine creates expectations that prove impossible to fulfill given the practical realities of governing two kingdoms with different languages, customs, and political traditions. The death of Henry V in 1422, just 2 years after his marriage to Catherine, transforms their union from a symbol of international cooperation into a source of new conflicts that will plague both kingdoms for generations. Catherine's position as widow of the English king and mother of the infant Henry VI creates a situation where her personal choices about remarriage carry implications for the succession to both the English and French thrones. The secret marriage between Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor, a Welsh squire in her household, illustrates how royal women's romantic choices can have consequences that extend far beyond their original scope. Their union, conducted without the knowledge or consent of the English government, produces children whose royal blood will eventually provide the foundation for the Tudor dynasty's claim to the English throne. But the immediate consequences of Catherine's marriage choice create a diplomatic crisis that demonstrates how completely royal romance had become entangled with international politics by the 15th century. The French court's response to Catherine's remarriage below her station reflects not only concerns about the dignity of their royal bloodline, but also strategic calculations about how the legitimacy of her children might influence future conflicts over the succession to both kingdoms. The Wars of the Roses that devastate England during the later 15th century represent, in part, the ultimate consequences of romantic choices made by royal women who believed that love might take precedence over political obligation. The competing claims to the English throne that fuel these conflicts can be traced back through a genealogy of marriages that illustrate how personal choices made in chambers, where candlelight created illusions of privacy and freedom, ultimately reshape the destinies of nations. Margaret of Anjou's marriage to Henry VI in 1445 provides the final example of how royal romance can become entangled with international conflict in ways that neither the participants nor their advisors can fully anticipate. Margaret arrives in England as part of a peace treaty that her marriage is designed to cement, but her strong personality and political ambitions transform her from a symbol of Anglo-French cooperation into one of the most controversial figures of the 15th century. The relationship between Margaret and Henry VI illustrates the complex ways in which royal marriages can succeed as personal partnerships while failing as political arrangements. Contemporary observers note the genuine affection between the royal couple, the way Margaret's intelligence and determination complement Henry's more gentle and contemplative nature, and the effectiveness of their collaboration in matters ranging from patronage of learning to the management of court ceremony. Yet these very qualities that make Margaret an ideal companion for her scholarly husband also make her a threatening figure to English nobles who believe that queens should exercise influence through subtle suggestion rather than direct participation in political decision-making. Margaret's willingness to take public stands on controversial issues and her obvious intelligence about matters of statecraft create resentments that eventually contribute to the conflicts that destroy her husband's reign. The tragedy of Margaret and Henry's relationship lies not in any failure of personal compatibility, but in the impossible circumstances that surround their attempt to build a marriage that serves both their individual needs and the diplomatic objectives that their union was designed to achieve. Their genuine partnership becomes a source of political vulnerability rather than strength, demonstrating how completely the medieval world's understanding of royal marriage had been transformed by 2 centuries of romantic idealism. As we draw near the end of our exploration of how royal hearts created international crises, we find ourselves contemplating the quiet moments when personal choices made in private chambers echo through the corridors of power, with consequences that extend across generations. The kings and queens whose stories we have followed discovered that love, once released from the constraints that medieval tradition had imposed upon it, becomes a force that recognizes no boundaries and respects no limitations. As the 15th century draws toward its close, like evening shadows lengthening across courtyards where the last roses of autumn release their perfume into air that carries the promise of winter, we find ourselves witnesses to the final acts of a drama that had been unfolding for 3 centuries. The romantic idealism that Eleanor of Aquitaine had planted in the gardens of medieval culture was about to encounter forces that would transform not only how rulers understood love and marriage, but how they comprehended the very nature of political power itself. In the opulent chambers of the Burgundian court, where tapestries woven with threads of gold and silver depicted scenes from the great romances of Arthurian legend, the last great flowering of medieval chivalric culture was reaching its magnificent and ultimately tragic culmination. The Dukes of Burgundy, rulers of territories that stretched from the North Sea to the borders of Switzerland, had created a court that surpassed even the legendary splendors of Camelot in its dedication to the ideals of courtly love and chivalric honor. Picture, if you will, the palace of Philip the Good in Bruges during the winter of 1429, when the halls echo with the sound of musicians whose melodies seem to capture the very essence of romantic longing. The Duke himself, now in his 30s and at the height of his power, moves through chambers where every detail has been designed to create an atmosphere that transforms the practical business of governance into something approaching high art. The very air seems perfumed with the scent of roses that bloom in heated gardens even during the coldest months, while the soft light of countless candles reflects off surfaces that gleam with the accumulated wealth of generations of successful merchants and skilled craftsmen. Philip's court has become a magnet for the greatest artists, poets, and musicians of the age, drawn by patronage that treats cultural achievement as seriously as military conquest or diplomatic success. Here, the ideals of courtly love that had once seemed like pleasant diversions from the serious business of medieval politics have evolved into a comprehensive philosophy of life that governs everything from the decoration of ceremonial chambers to the conduct of international negotiations. The woman who captures Philip's heart and ultimately reshapes the destiny of the Burgundian state bears the name Agnes Sorel, though history will remember her by titles that speak to her unprecedented influence over one of Europe's most powerful rulers. Agnes possesses the kind of beauty that seems to embody the aesthetic ideals that Burgundian artists have been pursuing for generations, features that might have been carved by the same hands that created the sculptures adorning the great cathedrals, combined with an intelligence that reveals itself in conversations that range across subjects from theology to natural philosophy. But Agnes brings to Philip's court more than mere beauty and intellectual accomplishment. She carries with her the sophistication of the French royal court, where she had served as lady-in-waiting to Marie of Anjou, and her presence in Burgundy represents not only a personal choice, but a diplomatic statement that will influence the balance of power throughout Western Europe. The relationship that develops between Philip and Agnes unfolds in chambers where the boundaries between public ceremony and private intimacy seem to dissolve, like morning mist touched by sunlight. Their conversations, conducted in voices that never rise above the level appropriate to royal presence, nevertheless carry implications that extend far beyond the personal realm into territories where love and politics become so intertwined that they cannot be separated without destroying both. Agnes's influence over Philip manifests itself not through the crude manipulation that medieval chroniclers usually attributed to royal mistresses, but through a more subtle process that demonstrates her understanding of how intellectual partnership can be transformed into political power. She participates in discussions of policy and strategy with insights that reveal her thorough understanding of the complex relationships between European courts, while her recommendations about matters ranging from artistic patronage to military appointments reflect a wisdom that Philip comes to value more highly than the advice of his most experienced counselors. The court that emerges under Agnes's influence represents the final flowering of medieval chivalric culture, but also contains within itself the seeds of transformation that will ultimately produce the Renaissance. The tournaments and ceremonies that Philip organizes to honor his beloved become showcases for artistic and intellectual achievements that point toward new understandings of human potential and individual worth that will eventually challenge the hierarchical assumptions upon which medieval society rests. Yet even as Philip and Agnes create their romantic utopia in the chambers of the Burgundian court, the practical realities of 15th century politics continue to assert their ancient authority. The territories that Philip rules have been assembled through generations of careful marriage alliances and strategic conquests, creating a patchwork of competing loyalties and interests that requires constant attention to prevent fragmentation under the pressure of local ambitions and external threats. The French court's response to Philip's relationship with Agnes illustrates how completely royal romance had become entangled with international politics by the mid-15th century. Charles II's attempt to reclaim Agnes's loyalty to France creates a diplomatic crisis that transforms a personal relationship into a matter of state security. While Philip's determination to protect his beloved from French pressure leads him to make military and political commitments that ultimately compromise Burgundy's independence. The tragedy that destroys this last great medieval romance begins not with any failure of love between Philip and Agnes, but with the inexorable advance of political and cultural forces that make their romantic idealism seem increasingly anachronistic in a world that is rapidly moving toward new forms of organization and authority. The rise of professional armies that fight for pay rather than honor, the development of gunpowder weapons that make individual heroism irrelevant in battle, and the emergence of merchant classes whose wealth derives from trade rather than land, all contribute to an environment where the values that had sustained courtly love for 3 centuries begin to seem like beautiful but impractical dreams. Agnes's death in 1450 at the age of only 28 marks not only the end of a great love story, but also the beginning of the end for the medieval world's understanding of the relationship between romance and political power. Philip's grief, which transforms him from a confident ruler into a man haunted by loss, demonstrates how completely the romantic idealism of his generation had come to depend upon personal relationships that could be destroyed by forces as simple and inevitable as disease and death. The court that Philip maintains after Agnes's death becomes a kind of museum dedicated to preserving the memory of a love that had seemed to justify the entire apparatus of medieval chivalric culture. The ceremonies and celebrations continue, but with a quality of desperate nostalgia that suggests their participants understand that they are performing rituals that have lost their connection to the living realities of political power. Meanwhile, across the patchwork of territories that comprise the Holy Roman Empire, other rulers struggle with their own versions of the conflict between romantic desire and political necessity. But in circumstances that reveal how completely the medieval world's assumptions about love and marriage are being challenged by new forms of economic and social organization. Frederick III, who ascends to the imperial throne in 1440, inherits not only the traditional titles and ceremonial dignities that had been passed down from Charlemagne, but also problems that earlier emperors could never have imagined. The territories that theoretically owe him allegiance have become increasingly independent under the rule of local princes, whose power derives more from their ability to manage the new commercial opportunities created by expanding trade than from the feudal obligations that had once bound the empire together. The woman who becomes Frederick's obsession illustrates how completely the nature of royal romance had been transformed by the social and economic changes of the 15th century. Eleanor of Portugal, whom Frederick marries in 1452, brings to their union not only the diplomatic advantages that her Portuguese connections represent, but also exposure to the new forms of knowledge and culture that Portuguese explorers are encountering in their voyages along the African coast and into the Atlantic. Eleanor's letters to her family in Portugal, which survive in archives that provide intimate glimpses into the emotional life of medieval royalty, reveal a woman struggling to reconcile her genuine affection for Frederick with her growing understanding that the Holy Roman Empire he rules exists more as a romantic ideal than as a practical political reality. Her descriptions of court ceremonies that attempt to maintain the dignity of imperial authority while lacking the resources to enforce imperial decisions create portraits of a world where form has become divorced from substance in ways that make continued existence impossible. The relationship between Frederick and Eleanor unfolds against the backdrop of the Ottoman advance into Central Europe. Military campaigns that expose the weakness of imperial institutions, while simultaneously creating opportunities for local rulers to demonstrate their independence from imperial authority. The romantic partnership that Frederick and Eleanor attempt to build in their private chambers becomes increasingly irrelevant to the practical challenges facing the territories they theoretically govern. Frederick's attempts to use his marriage to Eleanor as the foundation for broader diplomatic initiatives demonstrate how the medieval understanding of royal romance as a tool of statecraft was beginning to encounter the limitations imposed by new forms of political and economic organization. The Portuguese connections that Eleanor represents prove valuable primarily for the commercial opportunities they create, rather than for the military alliances that earlier generations of rulers would have prioritized. The children born to Frederick and Eleanor grow up in a world where the traditional assumptions about royal inheritance and dynastic succession are being challenged by forces that their parents can barely comprehend. Maximilian, who will become one of the last great Holy Roman emperors, learns from his parents' example that romantic love and political success need not be mutually exclusive, but also discovers that the forms of authority that had sustained earlier generations of imperial rulers are no longer adequate to the challenges facing late medieval governance. The marriage negotiations that surround Maximilian's eventual union with Mary of Burgundy illustrate how completely the nature of royal romance had been transformed by the political and economic changes of the late 15th century. The alliance that their marriage represents attempts to preserve the independence of the Burgundian territories that Philip the Good and Agnes Sorel had ruled together. But the diplomatic arrangements required to make this preservation possible demonstrate that the romantic idealism of Philip's generation has given way to calculations that prioritize practical advantage over personal fulfillment. Mary herself embodies the transformation that is overtaking European royalty during this period of transition. Educated in the humanist traditions that are beginning to spread from Italian courts throughout Europe, she brings to her marriage with Maximilian an understanding of political authority that owes more to classical models of governance than to the feudal traditions that had shaped her ancestors' approach to rule. The relationship that develops between Maximilian and Mary represents both the culmination of medieval romantic traditions and the beginning of their transformation into something that will eventually become recognizably modern. Their correspondence, conducted in multiple languages that reflect the cosmopolitan nature of late medieval court culture, reveals a partnership that combines genuine personal affection with sophisticated understanding of the diplomatic and military challenges facing their combined territories. Yet even as Maximilian and Mary attempt to preserve the best aspects of medieval chivalric culture while adapting to new political realities, forces beyond their control are reshaping the European political landscape in ways that make their romantic idealism seem increasingly anachronistic. The discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus in 1492 creates opportunities and challenges that dwarf the traditional concerns of European dynastic rivalry, while the development of printing technology makes possible new forms of communication and cultural exchange that undermine the exclusivity upon which royal authority has traditionally depended. The French invasion of Italy that begins in 1494 marks the beginning of a new era in European warfare, where professional armies equipped with gunpowder weapons make individual heroism irrelevant, and where strategic objectives are determined by economic calculations rather than considerations of honor or chivalric obligation. The battles that rage across the Italian peninsula during the final years of the 15th century create a new form of international conflict where romantic considerations play no role in determining outcomes. Meanwhile, in the courts of Spain, the marriage between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon demonstrates how royal romance can be successfully adapted to serve the practical objectives of state building while preserving enough of the medieval chivalric tradition to maintain popular support for royal authority. Their partnership, which combines genuine personal affection with ruthless pursuit of political objectives, creates a model that will influence European royal marriages for centuries to come. Isabella and Ferdinand's collaboration in the conquest of Granada and the sponsorship of Columbus's voyages illustrates how medieval romantic idealism can be channeled into projects that serve practical political objectives while preserving the emotional satisfaction that earlier generations had sought through purely personal relationships. Their court becomes a laboratory where the traditions of courtly love are transformed into tools for building the kind of centralized state that will characterize the early modern period. The Reconquista that Isabella and Ferdinand complete in 1492 represents not only the final expulsion of Muslim political authority from the Iberian Peninsula, but also the symbolic end of the medieval period's understanding of the relationship between love and political power. The romantic crusading idealism that had motivated earlier generations of Christian rulers gives way to calculations based on territorial consolidation and economic advantage that point toward the emergence of the modern state system. Yet even as the old forms of romantic idealism are being transformed by new political and economic realities, their influence continues to shape the expectations and behaviors of the last generation of medieval rulers. The court culture that develops around Isabella and Ferdinand preserves many of the ceremonial forms and cultural traditions that had characterized medieval chivalric romance, while adapting them to serve the practical objectives of early modern statecraft. The tragedy of this transitional period lies not in any failure of individual rulers to adapt to changing circumstances, but in the gradual recognition that the romantic idealism that had provided meaning and purpose for 3 centuries of European cultural development was becoming incompatible with the forms of political organization that new economic and military realities were making necessary. The death of Mary of Burgundy in 1482, thrown from her horse during a hunting accident at the age of only 25, symbolizes the end of an era in which royal women could exercise significant political influence through their romantic relationships with powerful men. Maximilian's grief, which transforms him from a confident ruler into a man obsessed with preserving the memory of a love that had seemed to embody all the best qualities of medieval chivalric culture, demonstrates how completely the romantic traditions of his ancestors had become dependent upon personal relationships that could be destroyed by simple accidents of fate. The court that Maximilian maintains after Mary's death becomes a kind of shrine dedicated to preserving forms of cultural expression that are rapidly becoming anachronistic in a world where political authority increasingly depends upon administrative efficiency rather than the kind of personal loyalty that romantic idealism had traditionally inspired. The tournaments and ceremonies continue, but with a quality of self-conscious nostalgia that suggests their participants understand that they are preserving traditions that have lost their connection to the practical realities of political power. As we near the end of our gentle journey through the chambers where medieval hearts collided with crowns, we find ourselves contemplating a transformation so complete that it seems almost miraculous. The romantic idealism that Eleanor of Aquitaine had introduced into medieval culture during the 12th century had grown and evolved through 3 centuries of royal love stories, each adding new dimensions to humanity's understanding of the relationship between personal desire and collective obligation. The kings and queens whose stories we have followed discovered truths about love and power that their ancestors could never have imagined. They learned that romantic relationships could serve as sources of political strength, but also that personal happiness often came at the cost of dynastic stability. They found that the pursuit of individual fulfillment could inspire cultural achievements of unprecedented magnificence, but also that such pursuits could create vulnerabilities that enemies were eager to exploit. Most importantly, they demonstrated that the human heart, once freed from the constraints that tradition had imposed upon it, becomes a force that recognizes no boundaries and respects no limitations. The love that had seemed so dangerous to medieval political stability had actually been preparing European culture for the transformations that would characterize the Renaissance and the early modern period. The court culture that emerged from 3 centuries of royal romance had created new forms of artistic expression, new understandings of individual worth, and new concepts of political legitimacy that would ultimately produce the cultural achievements we associate with the Renaissance. The troubadour traditions that had begun in Eleanor's courts had evolved into humanist learning that placed individual experience at the center of cultural investigation. The women who had claimed the right to choose their own romantic destinies had established precedents that would eventually contribute to new understandings of human rights and individual dignity. The men who had risked thrones for love had demonstrated that personal authenticity might be worth more than the preservation of inherited privileges. As the medieval period draws to its close, the great love stories that had shaped 3 centuries of European culture become memories preserved in chronicles that speak of a time when kings and queens believed that romance could transform the world. Their hopes had been both fulfilled and disappointed, their dreams both realized and shattered, but their legacy would endure in forms that they could never have anticipated. The Renaissance princes who inherited their thrones would approach love and marriage with calculations that prioritized practical advantage over romantic fulfillment. But they would do so in a cultural environment that had been permanently changed by 3 centuries of royal romance. The modern world's understanding of individual rights, personal dignity, and the relationship between private happiness and public responsibility all trace their origins back to the chambers where medieval lovers chose their hearts over their crowns. In the end, the greatest threat that love posed to medieval thrones was not its capacity to destroy individual rulers or topple particular dynasties, but its power to transform human consciousness in ways that made the medieval world's assumptions about authority and obligation ultimately untenable. The revolution that began in Eleanor of Aquitaine's courts had achieved a victory more complete than any military conquest, creating new forms of human possibility that would reshape not only European culture, but the entire trajectory of human civilization.